The first thing they stole wasn't my husband, it wasn't my company, it wasn't even my name. It was my place in a family legacy I had spent 25 years protecting. At the Silver Oak Heritage Foundation's anniversary celebration, nearly 400 guests rose to their feet as my husband accepted an award for preserving a legacy he had never created. Moments later, he reached for another woman's hand, slipped a diamond ring onto her finger, and announced that the future of our foundation would belong to the two of them. Then he looked directly at me. "I hope Eleanor understands that some people are meant to build the past," he said, with a practiced smile. "Others are meant to lead the future." A few people laughed, most froze. The cameras turned toward me, waiting for tears. They had planned every second of that moment. The lighting, the photographers, the speeches. Even the chair where I was supposed to sit quietly, while my own life disappeared in front of everyone who mattered. What neither of them realized was that I had already spent the previous 92 days preparing for this exact evening. I wasn't there to stop them, I was there to let them finish. My husband believed the applause belonged to him. The woman standing beside him believed replacing me in public would make history forget who built everything around us. Both of them had confused silence with surrender. I stood, smoothed the sleeves of my black evening dress, and walked toward the stage without hurrying. No one spoke. Even the string quartet stopped playing. Daniel extended one hand toward me, smiling for the cameras. "Eleanor," he said softly, "please don't make this embarrassing." I looked at him for a long second. "You already did." I held out my hand. He hesitated before giving me the microphone. That hesitation lasted less than 2 seconds. It would cost him everything. I turned, not toward the audience, but toward an elderly man waiting quietly beside the front row. For 30 years, Michael Bennett had been our family's attorney. Most people in the ballroom thought he was simply another guest. They had no idea he was carrying a leather portfolio containing every document that separated truth from performance. I placed the microphone in his hand. "Mr. Bennett," I said calmly, "would you please explain to everyone who actually owns the Silver Oak Heritage Foundation before tonight's announcements continue?" The smile disappeared from my husband's face. The woman beside him slowly lowered the hand, wearing the engagement ring. Across the ballroom, every camera turned away from the happy couple and focused on the leather portfolio that neither of them had ever bothered to read. Because the most dangerous mistake arrogant people make is believing the person who speaks the least knows the least. People often assume that the loudest person in a room is the one holding it together. They're almost always wrong. For 25 years, I built my life around making sure no one ever noticed how much work it took to protect something worth inheriting. Silver Oak Heritage Foundation wasn't just another charitable organization. It was the heartbeat of a small wine-growing community in Napa Valley. The foundation funded agricultural scholarships, preserved historic vineyards, helped family-owned wineries survive devastating wildfires, and maintained thousands of acres of protected land that my grandfather had begun purchasing after returning from World War II. When people admired the vineyards stretching across the hills each autumn, they saw beauty. I saw decades of contracts, impossible negotiations, sleepless nights, and promises made to families who trusted us with their futures. By the time I inherited responsibility for the foundation at 28, there wasn't much money left. There was land, there was history, there was debt, and there was a promise my father made from his hospital bed only 3 days before he died. Never let anyone confuse stewardship with ownership. At the time, I thought he was talking about protecting the vineyards from developers. Years later, I realized he had been warning me about people. I met Daniel Brooks at a fundraising dinner during one of the hardest years of my life. He wasn't wealthy, he wasn't connected. He had grown up in Oregon, working seasonal jobs at wineries while putting himself through college. What impressed me wasn't his resume. It was the way he could walk into a room filled with skeptical donors and somehow leave everyone believing tomorrow would be better than today. Hope came naturally to him. Structure came naturally to me. People said we balanced each other. Maybe we did. Or maybe I spent too many years confusing admiration with character. When we married, I never imagined he would become the public face of the foundation. That happened gradually. Journalists preferred interviewing the charismatic executive director instead of the woman buried inside financial reports. Television producers loved Daniel's smile. Donors remembered his speeches. Meanwhile, I preferred spending mornings visiting struggling vineyard owners and evenings reviewing trust agreements with attorneys. I wasn't hiding. I simply believed the work mattered more than the recognition. That decision would eventually cost me my own story. Melissa Carter entered our lives long before anyone suspected she would one day help destroy them. She had started as a volunteer coordinator barely a year after our wedding. Bright, fearless, endlessly energetic, she had an extraordinary gift for making people feel seen. Within 3 years, she became Director of Community Relations. Within 5, she was joining us for family holidays. When my mother passed away unexpectedly, Melissa organized every meal delivered to the house. When Daniel underwent emergency surgery after a skiing accident, she practically lived in the hospital waiting room beside me. When wildfires threatened our oldest vineyards, she worked 36 hours without sleeping to coordinate emergency housing for displaced workers. Trust isn't built through grand gestures. It's built through thousands of ordinary moments. She knew which wine glass belonged to my late father. She knew I always visited my parents' graves before every annual gala. She knew I never wore expensive jewelry, except for my grandmother's antique gold watch. She knew every fear I never admitted publicly. Looking back now, I understand something painful. The people who eventually betray you rarely begin as strangers. They begin as the people you stop questioning. The first subtle changes arrive so slowly that I barely notice them. Articles describing Daniel as the visionary behind Silver Oak, magazine covers featuring only his photograph, television interviews where reporters introduced me merely as his supportive wife. Whenever I mentioned correcting the historical record, Melissa would smile gently. "Eleanor," she'd say, "people connect with faces, not organizational charts." Daniel would laugh. "Everyone inside the foundation knows who really built this." I believed him. After all, I had never wanted applause, as long as scholarships were funded, as long as families kept their vineyards, as long as our promises were honored. I thought recognition was meaningless. What I didn't understand was this: history doesn't disappear overnight. It disappears one introduction, one newspaper caption, one speech, one photograph, one forgotten name at a time. About 18 months before our anniversary gala, Daniel began sleeping in the guest bedroom more often. He blamed stress, board meetings, travel, fundraising pressure. Melissa always had an explanation ready before I even asked. "He's exhausted. Major donors have been demanding. He's carrying too much." Then she would place a comforting hand over mine. "You've always been stronger than he is." I thanked her for caring. Today, I still wonder whether she felt guilty every time she said those words, or whether guilt had already disappeared long before I realized my marriage was quietly becoming someone else's future. Everything changed one rainy Tuesday evening, not because I caught them together, not because someone confessed, but because a single email landed in the wrong inbox. And with it, the first crack appeared in a perfect performance that had taken years to rehearse. The email arrived at 10:41 on a Tuesday night, while rain tapped softly against the library windows. Daniel had already gone upstairs. He said he needed sleep before flying to Seattle for a donor conference. Melissa had spent most of the afternoon reassuring me that he was simply overwhelmed. People who carry everyone's expectations eventually need room to breathe, she'd told me over coffee. "I worry about him." "I worry about him too," I answered. She smiled with such convincing tenderness that I almost apologized for asking. 45 minutes later, she accidentally handed me the truth. The subject line read, "Silver Oak Anniversary Final Program V8. Nothing unusual. Every major public event eventually crossed my desk." Although Melissa managed communications, I still approved anything presented under the foundation's name. The first 30 pages looked exactly as expected. Scholarship recipients, historical photographs, community projects, wildfire recovery, annual financial milestones. Then I noticed something strange. Near the bottom of one slide sat a small yellow comment bubble. Most people ignore comments inside presentation files. Years spent reviewing contracts had trained me never to ignore anything hidden. I clicked it. The comment expanded. "Daniel proposes immediately after Legacy Award. Pause 6 seconds. Camera 3 stays on Eleanor until security approaches." I read it twice, then a third time. My heartbeat didn't speed up. It slowed. I continued scrolling. The next slide wasn't part of the presentation. It had been marked hidden. A photograph appeared. Daniel and Melissa standing barefoot on a beach somewhere tropical. His forehead rested gently against hers. She was wearing the same pearl earrings I had given her for her 50th birthday. Across the bottom of the slide appeared a draft headline: Silver Oak enters a new era of leadership. Beneath it, Daniel Brooks and Melissa Carter announced their engagement. I kept reading. Another comment. After Eleanor signs transition documents, release press statement immediately. Do not allow unscripted media questions. If emotional, escort privately through East Hallway. There it was, not simply an affair, a production schedule. My humiliation had been storyboarded like a television broadcast. I leaned back in my chair. Outside, thunder rolled across the valley. Inside the house, the grandfather clock struck 11. Everything sounded perfectly ordinary. That frightened me more than anything. People imagine betrayal arrives like shattered glass. Mine arrived with perfect formatting. Curiosity replaced disbelief. I opened the version history, 34 previous drafts. Melissa had forgotten one important detail. Every revision remained permanently archived on our secure server. Version 28. Daniel's speech described me as a respected supporter who wishes to enjoy retirement. Version 24. Melissa had created a file titled Managing Eleanor's Public Reaction. Inside were bullet points. Avoid discussing ownership history. Frame Eleanor as emotionally exhausted. Highlight Daniel's years of visible leadership. Community wants stability. If necessary, mention health concerns. Health concerns. 3 months earlier, I had taken a 2-week medical leave after collapsing from exhaustion during wildfire recovery efforts. Melissa had driven me to the hospital herself. She held my hand while doctors assured me my heart was healthy. She cried when I cried. Now she planned to use that memory as evidence that I was too fragile to protect the legacy my family had entrusted to me. The next folder contained seating diagrams, security positions, media instructions, private exits. Everything had been rehearsed. Then I found something that transformed heartbreak into strategy. A document labeled Cedar Ridge Holdings. I frowned. I had never heard that name before. The attached files included land surveys, trust applications, draft partnership agreements, private investor presentations. Every one of them described a future where Silver Oak's most valuable vineyards would quietly move under the control of Cedar Ridge Holdings, immediately after my planned retirement. My marriage wasn't collapsing because Daniel had fallen in love with someone else. The affair wasn't the disaster, it was the distraction. The real objective had always been the land, the vineyards, the heritage licenses, the conservation easements. Everything generations of my family had spent nearly a century protecting. Daniel hadn't simply fallen out of love, he had mistaken proximity for ownership. Melissa hadn't simply betrayed a friendship. She had spent years rewriting history until she believed her own version of it. For the first time that night, I closed my eyes, not to cry, to think. If I confronted them now, they would delete everything. If I accused them, they would call it paranoia. If I filed for divorce immediately, the story would become about a bitter marriage. No. They had spent years preparing a performance. The only way to defeat a performance was to let the actors finish the play. I reached for my phone. There was only one person I trusted to answer at 11:30 on a rainy Tuesday without asking unnecessary questions. Michael Bennett, our family's attorney. He answered before the third ring. Eleanor, his voice sounded half asleep. Is someone hurt? I stared once more at the hidden presentation glowing on my computer screen. Not yet, I said quietly, but if we move carefully, the truth is about to hurt 2 people far more than they ever expected. Michael arrived at my home 38 minutes later, carrying nothing except a leather notebook and a pair of reading glasses he had owned for as long as I could remember. He didn't ask about the affair. He didn't ask whether I was all right. He asked the only question that mattered. Have they realized you know? I shook my head. Good. He placed the notebook on my desk. Then let's keep it that way. For the next 4 hours, we never once discussed my marriage. Instead, we talked about deeds, trust agreements, historic preservation covenants, donation restrictions, board bylaws. The foundation wasn't owned the way ordinary businesses were. My grandfather had designed it that way after watching family fortunes disappear through greed and lawsuits. No single executive, not even the executive director, could transfer protected land without approval from 3 independent trustees. Historic vineyards couldn't be sold unless conservation restrictions were legally removed. Scholarship endowments belonged to separate charitable trusts. The foundation's name itself was licensed through a family stewardship agreement, signed decades before Daniel and I ever met. Daniel had spent years standing in front of cameras. He had never bothered to learn what stood behind them. Michael closed the final binder. They've mistaken visibility for authority. I know. No. He looked directly at me. They've mistaken your kindness for ignorance. That sentence stayed with me, not because it comforted me, but because it explained everything. For years, I had believed allowing someone else to shine was generosity. Now I understood that generosity without boundaries eventually becomes permission. By sunrise, our small circle had grown. Rebecca Collins, chair of the foundation's independent trustees. Grace Holloway, our chief financial officer. Thomas Reed, director of estate compliance. 3 people, all over 50, all loyal not to me, but to the mission my family had protected for generations. None of them reacted with outrage. Experienced people rarely do. They simply began solving problems. Rebecca studied the hidden presentation for nearly 15 minutes without speaking. Finally, she removed her glasses. They're planning to replace stewardship with ownership, Grace nodded. And they're using public sympathy to force the board's hand. Thomas quietly turned another page. They've also underestimated how many legal promises are attached to these vineyards. No one mentioned Daniel's affair, not once. The betrayal mattered to me. The attempted theft endangered an entire community. That had to come first. Within 48 hours, a confidential review quietly began. No dramatic accusations, no surprise confrontations, no private investigators hiding in parked cars. Everything came from records already inside the foundation. Expense reports, access logs, travel reimbursements, board correspondence, archived presentation drafts. The truth has a remarkable quality. It rarely needs to be invented. It only needs someone willing to read it carefully. Meanwhile, I continued living exactly as Daniel expected. Every morning, I made coffee. Every evening, I asked about his meetings. When he complained about difficult donors, I listened. When he kissed my forehead before leaving for work, I kissed him back. Not because I still believed him, but because I needed him to believe me. Melissa visited the house almost every weekend. She still carried fresh flowers through the front door without knocking. She still rearranged books on my shelves as though she were family. One Saturday afternoon, she stood beside me in the kitchen while we prepared food for an upcoming charity luncheon. You've seemed quieter lately. Have I? She smiled. I worry you're carrying too much. The irony almost made me laugh. Instead, I handed her another cutting board. I'm just tired. Relief flashed across her face. Not concern, relief. She wanted tired. Tired people stop asking questions. Then she said something I would remember forever. Sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is let someone else take over. I looked down at the tomatoes I was slicing. The knife stopped halfway through. She thought she was preparing me, not for healing, but for surrender. I'll remember that, I said. I hope you do. Later that evening, after she left, I walked alone through the oldest vineyard on the property. The vines were nearly 80 years old. Some had survived fires, floods, economic recessions, entire generations. They remained standing because someone had cared for them season after season without demanding applause. I rested my hand against one weathered trunk. As a little girl, I used to ask my grandfather how he knew which vines would survive harsh winters. He always gave the same answer. The strongest roots grow quietly. I finally understood what he meant. Over the following weeks, Daniel and Melissa became increasingly confident. They scheduled meetings without inviting me. Press interviews suddenly referred to Daniel as the visionary guardian of Silver Oak. Melissa approved magazine articles describing me as gradually stepping away from leadership. No one asked whether I had actually said those words. Narratives spread faster than facts, especially when the facts remained silent. Every false article, every altered biography, every carefully edited photograph, became another page in the file Michael was quietly building. Daniel interpreted my silence as defeat. Melissa interpreted it as trust. Neither recognized it for what it truly was: preparation. Then, 23 days before the anniversary gala, Daniel placed a slim envelope on the breakfast table. Legacy Transition Agreement. Such an elegant title, such a dangerous lie. I smiled gently. I'll read it this weekend. For the first time in years, I saw impatience flicker across his face before the charming smile returned. That single expression told me something no document ever could. They weren't merely hoping I would cooperate. They were counting on it. And when people begin depending on your predictability, that is often the exact moment they become blind to your strength. I didn't sign the agreement. I didn't argue about it either. Instead, I placed the folder back inside the leather briefcase exactly as Daniel had left it, making sure every page sat in precisely the same position. People who prepare traps often inspect them afterward. I wanted him to believe nothing had changed. The following Monday, Michael and I met in a conference room that had no windows and no name on the building directory. It belonged to a law firm that specialized in charitable trusts. No one from the foundation had ever held a meeting there. Michael spread dozens of documents across the polished oak table: land deeds, insurance certificates, trust amendments, minutes from board meetings held decades earlier. Nothing dramatic. Yet buried inside those aging files was the single fact that Daniel had never discovered. Silver Oak itself wasn't the family's greatest asset. The land wasn't either. Neither were the vineyards. The real inheritance was something almost invisible: control. My grandfather had feared that future generations might confuse popularity with leadership, so he created what he called the Stewardship Charter. Every executive director could manage the foundation. Every public representative could speak for it. Every fundraiser could raise money in its name. But only one person held the legal authority to appoint or remove the independent trustees. That authority belonged to the chief steward, a position never advertised, never discussed publicly, never mentioned in annual reports. It existed quietly inside the original family trust. When my father died, he didn't leave me ownership. He left me stewardship. Daniel had spent years trying to become king. He never realized the kingdom had always been governed by a custodian. Michael smiled for the first time in weeks. Your grandfather trusted character more than charisma. I wish I'd inherited his instincts. You inherited them. He closed the folder. You just trusted the wrong people. Rebecca entered a few minutes later carrying another file. We finished reviewing Cedar Ridge Holdings. What did you find? She slid a photograph across the table. It showed a restored 19th century winery about 30 miles south of ours. Beautiful, historic, expensive. Daniel and Melissa planned to purchase it immediately after the anniversary gala. Not with their own money, but with funds quietly diverted through consulting agreements disguised as community development projects. Grace placed another document beside the photograph. There's something even more interesting. She pointed toward a handwritten note attached to the purchase proposal. Future headquarters. My eyes lingered on the words. They weren't planning to compete with Silver Oak. They were planning to replace it. Everything suddenly fit together: the carefully rewritten biographies, the media campaign, the engagement announcement, the transition agreement, the donor meetings, the false retirement narrative. None of it had been impulsive. It was succession theater. The affair wasn't the beginning. It was the marketing campaign. Later that afternoon, I attended our monthly executive meeting exactly as usual. Daniel stood confidently beside the projector. Melissa distributed printed agendas. She moved effortlessly around the room, smiling at everyone. If guilt existed inside her, she had become remarkably skilled at hiding it. Daniel outlined ambitious plans for the next chapter of the foundation. Several times he used the phrase modern leadership. Each time Melissa nodded enthusiastically. I noticed something else. Whenever board members asked technical questions about conservation agreements or trust obligations, Daniel looked toward me. He still expected me to provide the difficult answers. Old habits survived even inside betrayal. I answered every question calmly, exactly as I always had. At the end of the meeting, Daniel rested a hand lightly on my shoulder. I don't know what we'd do without you. I looked into his eyes. For one impossible second, I wondered whether he actually believed that. Whether somewhere beneath the ambition, beneath the lies, Beneath the applause, there remained the man I had married. Then Melissa interrupted. The photographers waiting downstairs. Daniel smiled and followed her. Neither noticed they had walked away together, not until the office door closed behind them. Grace remained seated. She watched the empty doorway for several seconds. I used to envy them. I looked at her. They seemed so confident. She gave a quiet laugh. Now I realize confidence built on deception requires constant maintenance. That evening, another piece of the truth arrived unexpectedly, not through lawyers, not through accountants, but through an elderly groundskeeper named Samuel Ortiz. Samuel had worked our vineyards for 43 years, long before Daniel, long before Melissa, long before I inherited anything. He knocked softly on my office door, holding a faded wooden box. I found these while cleaning the old storage room. Inside were dozens of photographs. Most showed harvest festivals from decades ago. Children running through vineyards, families celebrating together, employees laughing around picnic tables. Near the bottom lay one photograph I had never seen. It showed my father standing beside my grandfather during the dedication of the foundation. Behind them hung a simple wooden sign. Stewards serve. Owners possess. Never confuse the two. Samuel smiled gently. Your grandfather made everyone memorize that sentence. I traced the faded lettering with my fingertips. Daniel had spent years trying to possess what was never meant to be possessed. He believed legacy was something you could inherit by standing in front of it. My family had always believed the opposite. Legacy belonged to the people willing to protect it without demanding credit. As Samuel reached the door, he paused. Miss Eleanor. Yes? He looked toward the vineyards glowing beneath the setting sun. People around here haven't forgotten who planted the roots. For the first time since opening Melissa's email, I felt something stronger than grief. Not anger, not revenge, conviction. Because I finally understood that I wasn't fighting to save my marriage. I was fighting to keep an entire community from believing a carefully rehearsed lie. And somewhere inside that realization, the fear quietly disappeared. The night of the anniversary gala arrived wrapped in golden light. Guests began filling the historic estate just before sunset. Rows of vintage oak trees lined the stone driveway. Classical music drifted across the gardens. Crystal glasses reflected the fading California sky. Everything looked exactly the way Melissa had designed it. Elegant, timeless, perfectly choreographed. She greeted every guest with effortless warmth. Daniel moved through the crowd, shaking hands, laughing loudly, posing for photographs. Watching them together, no one would have guessed that both were standing on the edge of a cliff they had spent months building for themselves. I arrived 15 minutes before dinner. Not in silver, not in ivory, not in the soft blue gown Melissa had personally recommended. I wore black, simple, unadorned. The only jewelry I carried was my grandmother's gold watch. Several longtime employees noticed. None of them commented. Samuel caught my eye from across the courtyard and simply tipped his hat. That quiet gesture steadied me more than any speech could have. Inside the ballroom, nearly 400 people filled the tables. Donors, local families, community leaders, journalists, trustees, scholarship recipients, former employees who had worked alongside my grandfather. Every seat had been carefully assigned. Melissa believed she controlled the room. She didn't know Michael had quietly changed one detail the week before. Every independent trustee now sat close enough to the stage to stand within seconds. No one noticed. That was the point. Dinner unfolded smoothly. Awards were presented. Scholarship students received standing ovations. Families whose vineyards had survived the wildfires shared emotional stories. For nearly 2 hours, I almost forgot why I was there. Then the lights dimmed. Melissa walked onto the stage, looking radiant beneath the chandeliers. Tonight, she announced, we celebrate not only 25 extraordinary years, but the beginning of an even brighter future. Applause echoed through the ballroom. A video began playing across the enormous screen. It told the story of Silver Oak, or rather, the version Melissa had written. Daniel appeared in photograph after photograph, giving speeches, meeting governors, greeting donors, standing in vineyards. My father appeared once. My grandfather appeared twice. I appeared for less than 3 seconds. No mention of the trust. No mention of the conservation agreements. No mention of the years spent rebuilding after the fires. History had been carefully edited into something easier to sell. The audience applauded again. Daniel stepped forward as Melissa handed him the Legacy Stewardship Award. "I've always believed," he began, "that leadership means having the courage to embrace change." His voice carried effortlessly across the room. People leaned forward. He had always known how to command attention. "I owe tonight to many people." He thanked board members, employees, donors, community partners. Finally, he turned toward Melissa. "There is one person who reminded me that honoring the past should never prevent us from embracing the future." She walked onto the stage. The ballroom smiled. Some guests assumed another award was coming. Instead, Daniel reached into his jacket pocket. The ring sparkled beneath the lights. Gasps spread through the room. Melissa covered her mouth with both hands, performing surprise so convincingly that several guests began applauding before she even answered. "Melissa," Daniel said softly, "you've stood beside me through every challenge. You've believed in the future even when others remained trapped by the past." "Will you marry me?" she whispered. "Yes." The applause became thunderous. Photographers rushed forward. Flash after flash illuminated the ballroom. Then Daniel raised their joined hands. "There is something else." The room gradually quieted. "Eleanor and I have mutually agreed to end our marriage." A ripple of whispers passed through the guests. "Our lives have simply grown in different directions." He smiled with practiced sympathy. "We've also agreed that after the legal transition is complete, I'll continue leading Silver Oak into its next chapter." He looked directly at me. "I know Eleanor has always preferred working behind the scenes. I'm grateful she's finally ready to step aside." That lie hung in the air like smoke. Then came the final sentence. "The future of this foundation now belongs to Melissa and me." Silence, not applause. Silence. Exactly as they had rehearsed. Exactly as I had hoped. I stood. Every camera immediately turned toward me. Melissa's smile widened almost imperceptibly. She believed the performance had reached its final act. Daniel extended one hand. "Eleanor," his voice softened, "please don't make tonight difficult." I walked toward the stage, slowly, without anger, without hesitation. Each step echoed across the marble floor. When I reached him, I held out my hand. "The microphone." He hesitated, then handed it to me. He still believed he controlled the ending. I turned toward the audience. "My husband is right about one thing." The ballroom became perfectly still. "Tonight is about the future." I looked toward Michael Bennett. "Would you join me, please?" He walked onto the stage, carrying the familiar leather portfolio. Rebecca followed, then Grace, then Thomas, the four people Daniel had quietly dismissed for years. Daniel frowned. "What is this?" Michael accepted the microphone. "For 25 years," he began calmly, "Silver Oak Heritage Foundation has been protected by a legal structure designed to prevent exactly what has just been announced." Melissa's expression changed first. Daniel's followed. Michael opened the portfolio. "The executive director does not own this foundation. He cannot transfer its protected lands. He cannot appoint trustees. He cannot authorize succession. He cannot promise stewardship that was never his to give." The first document appeared on the massive screen. The original stewardship charter, signed 71 years earlier. The audience leaned forward. Michael continued. "Tonight, Mr. Brooks publicly represented authority he does not possess." Rebecca stepped beside him. "And in doing so, he fulfilled every legal condition required for his immediate removal." Daniel laughed, a sharp, nervous sound. "You can't be serious. I've led this foundation for 15 years. "You led its operations," Rebecca answered quietly. "You never owned its legacy." Grace pressed a remote. A second image appeared. The Cedar Ridge Holdings proposal. Then another. The hidden presentation comments. The staged camera instructions. The engagement announcement schedule. Melissa's face drained of color. "No," she whispered. Michael read aloud from the presentation comments. "Keep camera focused on Eleanor until security intervenes." A murmur swept through the audience. Another slide. Expense records. Private travel, consulting payments, land acquisition drafts. Every piece connected. Every lie supported by their own documents. Daniel looked toward Melissa. "You said you deleted those files." "I did." "No?" Michael interrupted. "You deleted one copy. The archive preserved 34 others." For the first time all evening, Daniel looked frightened. Real fear, not embarrassment, not anger. Fear, because he finally understood something irreversible. He hadn't been exposed by his enemies. He had been exposed by his own arrogance. Rebecca unfolded a final document. The independent trustees voted unanimously this afternoon. Effective immediately. Daniel Brooks is removed as executive director. Melissa Carter's employment is terminated for cause. Both individuals are prohibited from representing Silver Oak Heritage Foundation in any capacity. The ballroom remained silent, not because people were shocked, but because truth had replaced spectacle. Then something unexpected happened. Melissa slowly removed the engagement ring. She stared at it for several seconds before looking at Daniel. "You told me this would be our future." Daniel said nothing. "You promised we'd build something together." Still nothing. She laughed softly, a broken laugh. "So I was only useful until she was gone." Daniel finally answered. "You weren't supposed to hear that." The words escaped before he could stop them. Melissa closed her eyes. In that instant, their engagement ended before the applause celebrating it had even faded. Neither of them had betrayed only me. They had been preparing to betray each other all along. Michael quietly closed the leather portfolio. "The record," he said, "is now complete." No dramatic music played. No one cheered. The audience simply stood, one table after another. Not for revenge, not for humiliation, but for the quiet restoration of the truth. And for the first time in many years, history belonged to the people who had actually protected it. For several long seconds, no one moved. The chandeliers still glowed. The orchestra remained silent. Outside, the last light of sunset slipped behind the vineyards my grandfather had planted more than 70 years earlier. Daniel looked around the ballroom as though someone might still rescue him. The applause that had once followed him into every room had disappeared. Not because people suddenly hated him, but because admiration cannot survive the moment it discovers it has been built on deception. Security approached quietly. There were no raised voices, no struggle. One of the officers simply held out a small evidence envelope. "Mr. Brooks," he said respectfully, "we'll need your foundation credentials." Daniel stared at the badge clipped to his tuxedo. The small silver emblem had once opened every office, every archive, every private gate across the estate. Slowly, he removed it. For the first time in 15 years, he stood inside Silver Oak as nothing more than a guest. Melissa never looked at him again. She removed the foundation identification from around her neck and placed it on the stage floor beside the engagement ring. Neither object made much noise. Some endings never do. They simply become too heavy to carry. Michael leaned toward me. "You should probably say something." I looked across the ballroom. Nearly 400 faces were waiting. Employees, families, scholarship students, people who had trusted us with their futures. They deserved more than another dramatic speech. I stepped to the microphone. I know tonight wasn't the celebration anyone expected. A few people smiled sadly. I also know many of you are worried about what happens tomorrow. I paused. Tomorrow, the vineyards will still need tending. The scholarships will still be awarded. The harvest will still arrive. The foundation isn't one person. It never was. I turned toward Samuel, standing quietly near the back beside several vineyard workers. My grandfather used to say something I didn't fully understand until recently. Stewards serve, owners possess. I hope we never confuse those two things again. The room remained silent, not an uncomfortable silence, but the kind that settles when people recognize something true. Then Samuel began clapping, one pair of weathered hands, slow, steady. Another employee joined him, then another. Within moments, the entire ballroom rose to its feet. Not for me, but for the legacy that had survived all of us. Months passed. The investigations continued exactly as the law required. Daniel eventually accepted responsibility for financial misconduct connected to unauthorized transactions and resigned from several nonprofit boards before formal proceedings concluded. He disappeared from magazine covers almost as quickly as he had once appeared on them. Melissa wrote me a letter 6 months later, 32 handwritten pages. No lawyers, no excuses, no requests. Only an honest confession from someone who had finally run out of stories to tell herself. She admitted that somewhere along the way, she had stopped believing she was helping preserve a legacy. She had begun believing she deserved to own it. I read every page, then I placed the letter inside a wooden box with other family papers. I never answered. Some apologies deserve to be heard. Not all of them require a reply. One spring morning, nearly a year after the gala, I walked through the oldest vineyard with a group of scholarship students. Most were the first in their families to attend college. One young woman asked me a question I hadn't expected. "Were you angry?" I smiled. "For a long time." "What changed?" I looked across the hills. New vines had been planted where wildfire had destroyed the old ones years earlier. They were still small, still fragile, yet already reaching toward the sun. I realized anger spends all its energy looking backward. Stewardship looks forward. She nodded quietly, though I wasn't sure she fully understood. Neither had I at her age. Before leaving, she pointed toward the weathered wooden sign hanging near the entrance to the oldest vineyard. The same words my grandfather had chosen decades earlier. Stewards serve, owners possess. Never confuse the two. I smiled. This time, I finally understood why he never changed it. Because people come and go, titles change, newspapers forget, photographs fade. But character leaves roots. And roots don't care who stood closest to the cameras. They only remember who stayed long enough to keep the vineyard alive. As I walked back toward the estate house, the evening breeze carried the familiar scent of grapes warming beneath the California sun. For the first time in years, the silence around me no longer felt empty. It felt like home.